The failure of the ANC to register candidates in several metros before an IEC deadline could cost the party dearly if elections are held in October, if the Constitutional Court doesn't grant that postponement. The party faces the real risk of losing out on those key metros if a Constitutional Court ruling on the deferment of the elections does not go its way. Meanwhile, political analyst Dr Ralph Mathekga has launched his book, The ANC's Last Decade, How the Decline of the Party Will Transform South Africa. In fact, Dr Ralph Mathekga joins us now via our video link in Johannesburg. Ralph, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for your time this morning on the show. And, you know, my co-anchor Ayanda mentioned this when we were talking about your interview coming up. The fact that we've been here before. There have been situations within the governing party that have prompted analysts and political pundits to predict the demise of the governing party. What do you reckon is different this time?
Good morning, Michelle, and good morning to Ayanda and the viewers. Michelle, I think that the numbers are also speaking for themselves. The ANC is now below the 60%. Before it got there, it was also my prediction that the party was going to go below that 60%. So what you have now, you have problems that you have quite compounded to a point where now you have multiple inquiries demonstrating the weakness within the ANC. You have got the party that is not well aligned to actually move away from this or get beyond this or deal with decisively with the scourge of corruption. And now you have also the basic problems that we have just been speaking about, managing a party internally, paying salaries. The ANC is also going into a very unfamiliar electoral environment whereby we now have transparency regarding party finance. That means anyone who wants to finance the party now knows that their name will be known in the next reporting cycle according to the new law. So all of these things are making it very difficult for the party to hang on. The way in which it is happening, Michelle, it has already happened in urban centers. The ANC is barely hanging in the key metros in this country. And the key metros are just a little bit ahead of what I think is the national picture that is coming now.
Ralph, what's your take on the fact that this is not a simple decision by the IEC to make? This issue around the deadline to submit political party candidate lists. It's not as simple as you've missed the deadline and so your lists do not make it to the election. Because the ANC is the governing party, in fact, not having those candidates part of the upcoming polls will impact the freeness, the fairness of the polls themselves.
I mean, Michelle, you're onto something very important here. We should look at the gravity of the problem. Of course, the NC's internal capacity have declined, and also this is also because of the factional battle raging at branch level. You hear that the reason why the party could not meet the deadline is because of the technicality. And I think at least sanity prevailed that the ANC withdrew from that court case because they will have been humiliated at court. The reality is that they cannot finalize the list because of the infighting that have always been the case, but it has become quite intensified recently. So, Michelle, this is not just a simple issue of a party that has got 5% that has failed to submit the list. This is the party that has got a greater hold, the party whose participation, whether we like it or not, whose participation in this election certainly hinges on the or has impact on the credibility of the election. But something is quite sinister here, Michelle, because the NC knows exactly that they did not practically help the IEC to prepare the country to hold the election in October. So the only thing they prepared for, it is preparation to postpone these elections. And I think that it is almost inevitable, Michelle, where we are, that the elections are going to be postponed because it is impractical the way in which I see it. How did it become impractical? It's because of the incompetence, the lack of political will of the ANC to prepare the country. But fact as it stands now is that the ANC will still be able to fill those candidates because the system will have to start again because elections will have to be postponed. That's just the reality, Michelle. We can discuss how elections are going to look like if the ANC is out, but that's just a moot point. We are headed for a certain postponement.
Ralph, let's talk about your book, The Last Decade, the ANC's Last Decade. You're trying to imagine a South Africa in which there isn't this central a hub of power insofar as governance is concerned, where we don't have a single center of power. If political power is dispersed across society, how are you going about imagining a South Africa without a dominant ANC?
I mean, Michelle, I think it is already happening. I observe South Africa from the news point of view every day. And I can say that I speak to journalists, your colleagues, almost every day, 7 days a week. As I observe South Africa, I get to realize, Michelle, that there is a lot of progress and movement happening in our society. And this movement is not being led from the center. The center is already failing to exercise that role of rallying people around a particular political project or national question, whatever you call it. The center is no longer holding to that respect. But I think it is important to acknowledge that in our country, where we have the world's biggest antiretroviral, anti-HIV program, that program was not designed by government because of political will. It is a program that was pushed through litigation by the NGO. For me, that is the first indication that power is no longer concentrated in one place. The ANC does no longer command hegemony. Its policies get challenged throughout, and a string of victory is out there for everyone to observe about some of the policies that have been won in court battle. For me, it says that power is no longer just political, but it is dispersed across the society, across the institution. The NGOs are a center of power. They know how to go to court and litigate. They've done very well. I've worked in the NGO. Today, as we speak, Michelle, the Party Finance Act is in place. We are going to know who funds who in terms of political parties. This is not because political parties like it. I remember being in a meeting with political parties far back, 2005. They did not like this transparency, but it was pushed through litigation by the NGO. So the ANC is going to have to survive under that circumstances with its dwindling hold on the society. It's going to have to adapt. Yeah. And one thing about the ANC, it's not necessarily a sore loser. The cities have been running even without any much bigger, I would say, significant improvement without the ANC in some of the metros. So it is already happening, and I think it is becoming more and more. It's gradual, but it's getting to be concentrated in this decade where the ANC is going to learn to shop for coalitions to pass some of the decisions.
You'll correct me if I'm wrong, but your prediction puts it at 2029 when the ANC will lose its grip on power. Do the happenings of the past couple of weeks perhaps give us a sense that it might happen even sooner? Because the other thing is, Ralph, we never imagined a scenario where the ANC would even dip below the 60% mark, and yet here we are.
Indeed, I mean, even 2024 elections, the possibility of the ANC quite struggling. I mean, one province will most likely go. A province such as Gauteng, the ANC is holding by. If you look at the percentage that the ANC has in the province of Gauteng, you look at that they've been losing 3% election on election, and compounded by problems, it could be actually worse. Now the branches are divided because leaders are tearing each other apart. The party cannot even offer a coherent campaign platform. So if you look at that, 2024, they will be struggling, 2029. But Michelle, it does not matter very much the date that they slip below that 51%. The reality is that the ANC is no longer hegemonic as we speak. I mean, it is becoming also a regional structure as well. I think if you speak to ANC members in Limpopo and then you speak to some in KZN, it feels like we are speaking to people in two different countries. That's how I think power is decentralizing in this country. Whether or not the ANC likes it, it will have to learn to exist within such a decentralized system being pushed from below.
Is this a tragic event that's happening in our democracy, Ralph, or is this the lifespan of a liberation movement?
A fundamental question indeed. I mean, some people will say I'm controversial. One of the essential characteristics, Michelle, of South Africa's politics is that throughout this country, there has always been a clear center of power. A clear center of power during the time it was under the British Crown. It was the British. You knew who was in charge. During apartheid, during the Union, you knew who was in charge. The center of power was just one place, the National Party. In the post-apartheid as well, you knew the ANC was in charge. It was the center of power of political power. But I think what is tragic, it is the psychological impact of this. A nation that has always lived in looking in one place as a source of power, suddenly we have to survive in a political order whereby there are multiple centers of power. The court is a center of power, NGOs, the street through protest, multiple centers of power emerge. And I think for me, that's an essential democratic movement. For some people, it's tragic. I don't think it's tragic. I think it is just our psyche. We are not used to living in this type of uncertainty where we cannot point to one place and say we can predict a decision. It's quite unfamiliar.
Dr. Ralph Mathekga, it's always a great pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much for coming on to the AM Report. Dr. Mathekga has launched his new book, The ANC's Last Decade, How the Decline of the Party Will Transform South Africa. Also in some of the headlines in your morning papers discussing the governing party and the happenings of the past few weeks, months, years. Take your pick.